Most people watching this video will not go broke because they made one reckless decision. They will go broke because they trusted the system they were born into. Pause for a moment. That sentence should make you uncomfortable, not because it's dramatic, but because of how often it has already happened throughout history. Not to gamblers, not to extremists, but to ordinary, responsible people who followed the rules that once worked. Here's the uncomfortable truth most financial content avoids. Periods like the one we are living in almost never end gently. They end quietly for some, and catastrophically for others. Not overnight, not with a single crash, but through a slow, compounding erosion of purchasing power, opportunity, and security. If that sounds extreme, stay with me. Because what follows isn't emotional, it's historical. By the end of this documentary, you won't hear a prediction. You'll see a pattern. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let's begin with the central thesis. Clearly, calmly, without hype. Most Americans are structurally positioned to be poorer in the next decade than they are today, even if they work harder, save more, and follow every rule they were taught. Not because they're lazy, not because they're irresponsible, but because the economic system they rely on is changing faster than their assumptions. And historically, when this gap opens, wealth doesn't disappear, it concentrates. That is always what happens next. Before we talk about the future, we need to dismantle a comforting illusion about the present. Right now, on paper, the US economy looks resilient. Employment appears strong, wages are rising nominally, markets recover quickly. The headlines speak of soft landings. But history teaches us something critical. The most dangerous economic periods are often the ones that look stable, right before they are in a T. In the late 1920s, unemployment was low. In the late 1960s, America felt unstoppable. In the mid-2000s, home ownership was celebrated as proof of progress. In every case, the system was already breaking, invisibly, and the people who suffered most were not reckless speculators. They were workers, savers, families, people who trusted yesterday's rules in a system that had already moved on. Here's the part that rarely gets discussed. Economic breakdown doesn't announce itself with sirens. It whispers through daily life, rent rising faster than wages, savings earning less than inflation, debt becoming normalized rather than temporary, jobs becoming fragile, not disappearing, just less secure. Nothing breaks all at once, but slowly, quietly, the math stops working. And when the math stops working for enough people, the system adjusts, not in their favor. Let's zoom out. Every major economic era follows a recognizable sequence. First comes growth, then leverage, then complexity, then fragility, and finally, reset. This is not ideology, it's observable across centuries. The Roman Empire debased its currency, the Spanish Empire inflated itself with silver. France, before the Revolution, financed prosperity with debt. The British Empire entered long stagnation before decline. Each time, people believed stability was permanent until it wasn't. The names change, the technologies change, the pattern does not. Now let's bring this back to the present. For most Americans under 45, their entire adult life has existed inside a financial anomaly. Low interest rates, rising asset prices, cheap debt, globalized supply chains, a dollar that rarely appeared to weaken. This environment trained behavior. Borrowing felt safe, saving felt optional, assets felt guaranteed. But that environment is ending, not suddenly, structurally. And systems do not warn you when they cross that line. They let you discover it personally. If this resonates so far, stay with me. Because the next layer explains why working harder is no longer sufficient. Here's a quiet but devastating shift that defines this era. Income has decoupled from stability. For decades, the social contract looked like this. You trade time and skill for income. Income buys security. Security builds a future. That chain is now broken. Today, millions of Americans earn more nominal dollars than their parents, yet can afford less. Housing consumes a larger share of income. Healthcare behaves unpredictably. Education functions as a debt instrument, not a ladder. Retirement shifted from guaranteed to self-managed and market-dependent. This is not personal failure. It is a systemic redesign. Let's talk about inflation, but not the way headlines do. Inflation is not just prices rising, it is purchasing power transferring. When inflation persists, savers lose. Wage earners fall behind. Debtors benefit selectively. Asset holders gain. This is why inflation is tolerated longer than people expect. It functions as a quiet tax, one that doesn't require legislation. Historically, governments choose inflation, not because it's ideal, but because it's survivable. And the cost is diffused across millions of people who feel poorer, yet struggle to identify a single cause. Pause here and ask yourself honestly, has your life become more expensive faster than it has become more secure? That question matters more than GDP, because macro numbers don't pay rent. We'll return to this. Debt is the other half of this equation. Debt itself is not inherently bad, but systemic dependence on debt always signals fragility. Today, households, corporations, and governments are all leveraged simultaneously. That matters. Because when everyone owes more than they can comfortably service, the system loses flexibility. Interest rates cannot remain low indefinitely. And when they rise, stress reveals itself, not instantly, but gradually, through defaults, layoffs, and policy responses that prioritize stability over fairness. This is where systems begin to feel rigged, even without intentional manipulation. Now let's talk about jobs. Not unemployment, job quality. Automation doesn't eliminate work overnight. It compresses wages. Global competition doesn't erase opportunity. It weakens bargaining power. Technology doesn't replace people instantly. It makes them interchangeable. The result is a labor market where income volatility increases, even for skilled workers. And volatility is the enemy of financial planning. You cannot save consistently when income fluctuates. You cannot invest confidently when expenses are unpredictable. You cannot build resilience when shocks arrive frequently. This is not collapse. It is erosion. There's a historical parallel most people miss. In the 1970s, inflation surged. In the 1980s, interest rates spiked. In the 1990s, globalization masked wage stagnation. In the 2000s, debt filled the gap. In the 2010s, asset inflation replaced income growth. Each decade solved the previous problem temporarily by creating a new dependency. Now, we are running out of easy solutions. That is what makes this period different. We have reached a point where policy tools conflict with one another. Raising rates fights inflation, but threatens debt stability. Lowering rates supports markets, but fuels inflation. Cutting spending risks recession. Spending more pressures the currency. There is no painless option, so policymakers choose delay. Delay shifts cost forward, and the future is arriving faster than most people expect. Here is the uncomfortable reality. The system does not need everyone to thrive. It only needs enough people to function. Historically, during resets, wealth protection happens first. Stability for the middle comes second. Relief for the bottom comes last, if at all. This is not cynicism, it is pattern recognition. At moments like this, societies divide into two groups. Those who assume tomorrow will resemble yesterday, and those who notice the rules changing. The first group is always larger, the second group is quieter. We're not finished. Because in part 2, we confront the most dangerous misconception of all, the belief that this is just another cycle, and things will naturally return to normal. They don't always, and when they don't, the transition is not dramatic, it is bureaucratic, incremental, quiet. It catches people midlife, with responsibilities, dependence, and no margin for error. Before you click away, consider this. Every major financial reset looked obvious in hindsight and unimaginable in advance. The people who suffered most were not uninformed. They were certain. There is a moment in every extended economic cycle when people stop asking, is something wrong? And begin asking, why does this feel impossible? That moment does not arrive with panic. It arrives with exhaustion, when effort no longer produces progress, when doing everything right still leaves you behind, when stability feels like something other generations experienced. That is not personal failure. That is the sound of the math breaking. The most dangerous misconception during periods like this is the assumption that recovery means returning to the previous normal. Historically, that almost never happens. What follows instead is a transition to a new equilibrium, one that preserves the system, not individual expectations. And the cost of that transition is rarely distributed evenly. Let's close an open loop. Why does this feel different from 2008 or 2001 or the 1970s? Because those crises occurred inside systems with room to expand. Younger populations, lower debt, lower baseline costs, broader productivity gains. Today, those buffers are thinner. Populations are aging. Debt is historically high. Productivity gains concentrate narrowly. Political tolerance for pain is low. This combination limits how systems respond. When affordability collapses quietly, households adapt first. They downsize expectations. They delay milestones. They normalize insecurity. Rent becomes permanent. Retirement becomes abstract. Savings become intermittent. None of this looks like crisis. It looks like a generation treading water. Then institutions adapt. Companies prioritize margins. Governments prioritize stability. Policy shifts from growth to containment. You'll hear new language, resilience, adjustment, new normal, which often translates to lower expectations, formalized. This is when inequality hardens, not explosively, structurally. Mobility slows, wealth stops circulating. Assets remain with those who already own them. Because the process is gradual, it rarely triggers outrage. It produces resignation. After the inflationary crisis of the 1970s, the U.S. did not return to post-war expansion. It entered an era defined by financialization, debt dependence, and asset-based wealth. For some, this was prosperity. For many, it marked the beginning of permanent precarity. That divergence compounded over time. Now imagine that process starting from a weaker position. Higher costs, more leverage, lower trust, faster technological displacement. That is the environment ahead. Not collapse, compression. This is unsettling because compressions don't create villains. They create inevitability. You didn't fail. You were outpaced. The signals that matter most are not market crashes or unemployment spikes. Those arrive later. The real signals are structural. The share of income spent on necessities, the ratio of asset prices to wages, the concentration of growth. When these diverge long enough, resets follow, not by choice, by necessity. Policy will not fix this. It can delay outcomes, redistribute pain, soften extremes, but it cannot restore an economic structure misaligned with reality. When expectations, costs, and productivity diverge too far, purchasing power adjusts. That is the release valve. Now let's address the title directly, without drama. Why you will be broke by 2030 is not a prophecy. It is conditional. If structures persist, if assumptions remain unchanged, if behavior fails to adapt, then many people will feel poorer in real terms regardless of effort. Not because they ran out of money, but because money buys less of what matters. People prepare for crashes. They do not prepare for stagnation. Crashes are brief. Stagnation is long. Entire societies have lived inside it for decades. Japan after the 1990s. Southern Europe after the debt crisis. Empires in slow decline. Life continues. Opportunity narrows. This is where conventional advice begins to fail. Work harder. Save more. Wait it out. Those strategies assume stability. In transition, they become incomplete. Not wrong, insufficient. The system rewards awareness before effort. It always has. In every historical shift, those who recognized patterns early had options. Not guarantees. Options. Everyone else adapted later, when choices were narrower. What happens next is uncertain in timing but consistent in structure. Resolutions arrive through combinations of currency adjustment, debt restructuring, asset repricing, expectation resets. Claims on the future are reduced, quietly or forcefully. The mechanism changes, the outcome does not. This is why certainty is more dangerous than fear. Certainty that things will return to normal. Certainty that systems always recover unchanged. Certainty that nothing fundamental is shifting. History punishes certainty. This documentary is not a call to panic. It is a call to observe, to question inherited assumptions, to recognize that survival increasingly depends on positioning, not effort alone. There is no single action that guarantees safety. Flexibility matters. Low fixed costs, optionality, adaptability. These traits have always outperformed rigid planning during transitions. Always. Every generation believes the system it inherited is permanent until it isn't. The most dangerous moment is not collapse. It is the moment before acceptance. When evidence accumulates, yet belief resists. This is not a prediction. It is a warning about inertia. Patterns do not require belief, only time. If you disagree, good. That means you're thinking. If this made you uncomfortable, that's also good. Discomfort often signals assumptions being challenged. The real question is not whether the next decade will be harder. It is whether you will recognize the shift while there is still room to move. Subscribe, not for answers, but for continued analysis of economic systems, historical patterns, and the forces shaping your future beyond headlines. Understanding does not guarantee safety, but ignorance almost guarantees exposure.